The billionaire froze when the young woman walked into his office. She was soaked from the rain. Her hands were shaking, and in her hand was an old photograph of a little girl standing beside him. A girl he had abandoned 20 years ago. He stared at the photograph, then at her face. "Who are you?" The woman swallowed hard. "My name is Emily Carter." The billionaire's face suddenly turned pale, because that was the name of the daughter he had been told was dead. But Emily wasn't there for money. She had come to give him something far more dangerous. A DNA report, and the name written on the final page would destroy everything he had built. 20 years earlier, Richard Carter had been one of the most powerful businessmen in America. His company owned hotels, technology firms, luxury apartments, and private hospitals. He had everything money could buy, except a happy family. His wife, Laura, had died when their daughter was only 3 years old. After her death, Richard became obsessed with work. He convinced himself that money would protect his daughter, but instead, it pushed them apart. One night, Richard received a phone call. A car accident had occurred. His daughter, Emily, was missing. Search teams looked for days. Nothing. Richard was told there was almost no chance she had survived. Broken by grief, he buried her memory. Or at least, he tried. Years passed. Richard became even richer. But every birthday, he secretly placed a small photograph of Emily on his desk. He never told anyone. Then, 20 years later, Emily walked through the gates of Carter Enterprises. The security guard stopped her. "You need an appointment." Emily looked toward the tower. "I don't need one. Mr. Carter doesn't meet people without appointments." Emily quietly replied, "He'll meet me." The guard laughed. "Who are you?" Emily looked at him. "His daughter." The guard stopped smiling. Within minutes, the entire security department knew. Richard was informed. He ordered them to bring her upstairs. When Emily entered his office, Richard stared at her. He couldn't speak. Her eyes were the same. Her smile was the same. Even the tiny scar above her eyebrow was exactly where he remembered it. Richard whispered, "Emily." She nodded. "Yes." He stood. "You're alive." "I've been alive for 23 years. Richard's eyes filled with tears. "Where have you been?" Emily placed an envelope on his desk. "That's why I'm here." Richard opened it. Inside was a DNA report. He read the first page, then the second. His hands began shaking. "This isn't possible." Emily looked at him. "You're my father." Richard stared. "I know." "No." Emily shook her head. "You don't understand." She pointed toward the final page. Richard read the last line. His face turned completely white. The DNA report didn't just confirm that Emily was his daughter. It revealed something else. Richard Carter was not Emily's biological father. Richard looked up. "Who are you?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know." Then she added, "But the man who raised me knows." Richard froze. "Who?" Emily whispered. "The man who kidnapped me 20 years ago." Before Richard could answer, the office door opened. An old man entered. Richard immediately recognized him. His former business partner, Thomas Blake. Thomas looked at Emily, then at Richard, and said, "You were never supposed to find her." Richard stood slowly. "Find who?" Thomas pointed at Emily. "Your real daughter." Richard stared at Thomas. "What did you just say?" Thomas didn't answer. Emily stepped toward him. "You know me." Thomas looked at her. "I knew you when you were 3. Richard's heart pounded. "You were there the night she disappeared." Thomas nodded. "Yes." Richard grabbed him by the collar. "You knew she was alive?" Thomas didn't resist. "Yes." "Where was she?" Thomas looked at Emily. "She was raised in a small town under another name." Richard's eyes filled with anger. "Why?" "Because someone wanted you to believe she was dead." "Who?" Thomas looked toward the office windows. "Your board." Richard froze. "My board?" Thomas nodded. 20 years ago, Carter Enterprises was almost bankrupt. Richard shook his head. "My company was never bankrupt. It was." Thomas pulled out an old folder. "You lost almost $2 billion. Richard opened it. Inside were financial documents he had never seen. His signature appeared on several pages. Richard stared. "I never signed these." Thomas replied. "You did." "I don't remember." "You were drugged." Silence. Emily looked at Richard. "My entire life was built on a lie." Richard looked at her. "Who raised you?" Emily hesitated. "A man named Daniel." Richard frowned. "Daniel who?" "Daniel Carter." Richard froze. "That name?" Thomas nodded. "He was your older brother." Richard stepped backward. "My brother died before I was born." Thomas shook his head. "No." Richard couldn't breathe. Then why did my parents tell me he died? Because he knew what your father was doing. Richard looked confused. What was my father doing? Thomas opened another file. Richard read the title. Carter Family Trust, Confidential. The document revealed that Richard's father had secretly created a second company. A company controlled by the family. But the company wasn't listed publicly. It owned billions of dollars in hidden assets. Richard stared. Where is this money? Thomas replied. Your father gave it to Daniel. Richard's eyes widened. Why? Because Daniel was supposed to inherit the family empire. Richard suddenly understood. That means, yes. Thomas looked at him. You were never supposed to be CEO. Richard's face became pale. You stole it. Thomas nodded. Not me. Then who? Thomas looked toward Emily. Her. Richard stared. What? Your father changed the inheritance before his death. Thomas handed him another document. Richard read it. The hidden Carter family fortune had one beneficiary. Emily Carter. Richard looked at Emily. You own everything. Emily shook her head. I don't want your money. Richard stared. Then why come back? She looked directly into his eyes. Because someone is trying to kill me. Richard's expression changed. Who? Emily placed another photograph on the desk. It showed a black SUV. 3 days ago, someone followed me. Richard looked at the photograph. Did you report it? No. Why? Because the police officer I reported it to was already working for them. Richard froze. Thomas stepped closer. Richard, you have enemies inside your own company. Richard looked at him. How many? Thomas answered. Enough to destroy you. Suddenly, the office lights went out. Emily grabbed Richard's arm. A loud crack echoed through the window. The glass shattered. Richard pulled Emily to the floor. Thomas shouted. Get down. Another shot. Then silence. Richard looked toward the broken window. Someone had fired from a building across the street. But the shooter wasn't aiming at Richard. He was aiming at Emily. Richard stared at his daughter. For the first time in 20 years, one thought filled his mind. Someone wanted his daughter dead. And Richard was willing to do anything to protect her. Richard moved Emily into a secure penthouse. 24-hour security surrounded the building. But Emily still didn't trust him. You abandoned me once. Richard looked down. I didn't know you were alive. You stopped looking. I searched for 3 years. And then? Richard didn't answer. Emily whispered. You gave up. Richard looked at her. Yes. The word hurt more than anything. I thought you were dead. Emily turned away. I wasn't. I know. You should have kept looking. Richard lowered his eyes. You're right. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He went to his father's old study, a place he hadn't entered in 20 years. He opened an antique desk. Inside was a locked metal box. He had never seen it before. Thomas had once told him, your father left something behind. Richard found a key hidden beneath the desk. The box opened. Inside was a letter. Richard unfolded it. The handwriting was his father's. Richard, if you're reading this, Emily has returned. Richard's hands trembled. The letter continued. Do not trust Thomas. Richard froze. He immediately searched the box. Another document. Another photograph. And finally, a small USB drive. Richard took it to his computer. A video appeared. His father was sitting in the same study. Older. Weak. He looked directly into the camera. If Emily returns, she will come looking for the truth. Richard watched silently. His father continued. Your daughter was never kidnapped by strangers. Richard's breathing stopped. She was taken by someone inside this family. Richard looked toward the door. The video continued. I did it because I discovered what your brother Daniel had done. Richard whispered. My brother. His father continued. Daniel discovered that the Carter family fortune had been built on stolen technology. Richard stared. What technology? The video revealed secret patents. Medical technology. Artificial intelligence. Military communications. All stolen from a small research company. Richard's father had taken the technology and built Carter Enterprises with it. But Daniel had discovered the truth. He threatened to expose everything. So the family made him disappear. Richard stared at the screen. His father continued. I couldn't allow Daniel to destroy the family. Richard whispered. You killed him. The video went silent for several seconds. Then his father said no. He survived. Richard's eyes widened. He took Emily and disappeared. Richard stood. His brother was alive. Somewhere. The video continued. And if Emily ever returns. His father's expression became serious. Daniel will return too. The screen went black. Richard stared. Then someone spoke behind him. Too late. Richard turned. Thomas stood in the doorway. Richard's face hardened. You knew? Thomas nodded. I knew everything. Where is my brother? Thomas smiled. Closer than you think. Richard stepped forward. What does that mean? Thomas looked toward the hallway. Emily stood there. She had heard everything. Daniel is alive? Thomas nodded. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Who is he? Thomas looked at her. Your grandfather. Richard froze. Emily couldn't speak. Her entire life had been another lie. The man she believed was a stranger was actually the grandfather she had never known. Then the penthouse alarm suddenly sounded. Security cameras showed dozens of armed men entering the building. Richard grabbed Emily's hand. We have to go. Emily looked at him. Where? Richard answered. To find your grandfather. Richard, Emily, and Thomas escaped through an underground tunnel. They drove for hours. Finally, they reached a small farmhouse outside the city. An old man opened the door. Richard stopped breathing. The man looked at him. Hello, little brother. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Daniel. Daniel smiled. You finally found me. Emily stared at him. Grandpa. Daniel looked at her. His expression broke. My little girl. Emily rushed into his arms. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Richard asked, Why did you take her? Daniel looked at him. I didn't take her. Richard frowned. You disappeared with her. I saved her. From what? Daniel looked directly at him. From you. Richard stepped backward. I never wanted her hurt. You didn't have to. Daniel pointed toward him. You were destroying everything. Richard lowered his head. You're right. Daniel looked surprised. You finally admit it? Richard nodded. I know what Dad did. Daniel froze. How? I found his files. Daniel looked toward Thomas. You told him? Thomas shook his head. He found them himself. Daniel sighed. Then you know the truth. Richard nodded. All of it. Daniel walked toward a safe. He opened it. Inside were dozens of documents. These are the original patents. Richard looked at them. If these become public, Carter Enterprises collapses. Daniel nodded. And thousands of people lose their jobs. Richard looked at him. Then what do you want me to do? Tell the truth. Richard stared. You know what happens if I do? Yes. I lose everything. Daniel nodded. Yes. Richard looked at Emily. She was watching them. Maybe that's what I deserve. Emily stepped forward. No. Everyone looked at her. She said, You deserve to lose what you stole. Richard's eyes filled with tears. But you don't deserve to lose your life because of it. Emily looked at Daniel. Who is trying to kill me? Daniel's face became serious. The person who benefited most from your father's empire. Who? Daniel answered. Thomas. Richard turned. Thomas stood near the doorway. He was holding a gun. Daniel immediately moved in front of Emily. Thomas smiled. You always were predictable. Richard stared at him. You were behind everything. Thomas nodded. I needed Emily alive long enough to sign the inheritance documents. Emily froze. What? Thomas laughed. Your grandfather's fortune is worth more than you can imagine. Daniel stared at him. You killed people for money. No. Thomas looked at Richard. I killed people because Richard wouldn't give me what I deserved. Richard stepped forward. You wanted the company. I built half of it. You stole half of it. Thomas raised the gun. Enough. Emily stepped between them. Don't. Thomas pointed the gun at her. Richard shouted. Emily moved. A gunshot echoed. Daniel pushed Emily aside. The bullet hit him. He fell. Grandpa. Emily dropped beside him. Richard attacked Thomas. The two men struggled. The gun fell to the floor. Thomas ran. Richard chased him. Emily held Daniel. Please don't die. Daniel smiled weakly. You came back. Emily cried. I never should have left. Daniel whispered. You didn't. He looked at Richard. Take care of her. Richard knelt beside him. I will. Daniel closed his eyes. Richard shouted. Daniel. For several terrifying seconds, there was no response. Then Daniel opened his eyes. I'm not done yet. Daniel survived. But the bullet had done serious damage. Thomas was arrested before he could escape the state. Yet the real battle was still ahead. Richard had to decide whether to expose Carter Enterprises. His lawyers warned him. If you release these documents, the company could collapse. His board demanded silence. Investors threatened lawsuits. News organizations waited outside his home. Richard had one choice. Protect his empire. Or tell the truth. He walked into the press conference alone. Hundreds of reporters waited. Richard stood behind the microphone. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, my name is Richard Carter. I built my company on technology that wasn't mine. The room exploded with questions. Richard continued. My family stole intellectual property. We covered it up, and innocent people suffered because of it. He looked directly into the cameras. I am responsible. The next morning, Carter Enterprises stock collapsed. Banks froze accounts. Government investigators opened cases. Richard lost billions. His mansion was seized. His private jet was sold. His name became one of the biggest scandals in American business. But Richard didn't regret it. Because for the first time in his life, he had chosen his family over his fortune. Weeks later, Richard visited Daniel in the hospital. Emily was sitting beside her grandfather. Richard walked in carrying a small box. Daniel looked at him. What is that? Richard placed it on the table. Your father's original family documents. Daniel opened the box. Inside was the Carter family ring. Richard said, It belongs to you. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked at Emily. It belongs to her. Emily stared. Me? Daniel nodded. You're the reason all of this finally ended. Richard smiled. She deserves it. Emily looked at the ring. Then at her father. Dad. Richard froze. It was the first time she had called him that. Yes. I don't need the ring. Richard smiled. I know. I don't need the money either. I know. Emily took his hand. I just wanted my father. Richard's eyes filled with tears. I should have been there. You're here now. Richard hugged her. For the first time in 20 years, he held his daughter without fear. But there was still one final secret. Daniel watched them from his hospital bed. He smiled. Then he called Emily over. There is something you need to know. Emily walked closer. What? Daniel handed her a letter. This was written by your grandmother. Emily opened it. The letter contained only one sentence. A family is not defined by the blood you inherit, but by the people who choose not to abandon you. Emily began crying. Richard looked at Daniel. That's the truth we should have learned 20 years ago. Daniel smiled. Yes. Then he closed his eyes. Richard panicked. Daniel. Daniel opened them again. Relax. He smiled. I just wanted to sleep. Everyone laughed through their tears. For the first time, the Carter family wasn't hiding from the past. They were finally facing it. 1 year later, everything had changed. Carter Enterprises no longer existed. The stolen technology had been returned to its original creators. The victims received compensation. Richard had lost almost everything financially, but he had gained something he never thought he would have again. A family. He moved into a small house. No security guards. No private jets. No enormous mansion. Just a quiet home with a small garden. Every Sunday morning, Emily visited. Sometimes Daniel came too. They ate breakfast together. They laughed. They argued. They told stories. They lived like an ordinary family. One Sunday, Emily walked into the kitchen carrying an envelope. Dad. Richard looked up. What is it? She placed it on the table. I got accepted. Richard opened the letter. Emily had been accepted into medical school. Richard smiled. Your mother would have been so proud. Emily nodded. I wish she could see me. Richard reached across the table. She can. Emily looked at him. How? Every time you help someone. Emily smiled. Then she noticed something on the counter. The old family ring. Why is that there? Richard picked it up. Your grandfather gave it to me. He gave it to you? Richard nodded. He said I had to give it to you when you were ready. Emily shook her head. I told you I don't want it. Richard smiled. You don't have to wear it. He placed it in her hand. Just keep it. Emily looked at the ring. Then at her father. I will. Suddenly, Daniel entered the kitchen. Are you two talking about me again? Emily laughed. Grandpa. Daniel smiled. I heard my name. Richard looked at him. You always do. They laughed. Daniel sat down. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Emily looked at both men. Can I ask you something? Richard nodded. What? Do you ever regret what happened? Richard looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Emily. Finally, Richard answered. Every day. Emily lowered her eyes. But, Richard continued. If I could go back, I would change everything. Daniel smiled. No. Richard looked at him. No. Daniel shook his head. I would change the mistakes. But not the people. Daniel looked at Emily. Because those mistakes brought her back to us. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table. The three of them held hands. For 20 years, they had been separated by lies, money, fear, and secrets. But none of that mattered anymore. Because sometimes, the greatest fortune isn't the money you inherit. It isn't the house you own. It isn't the company you build. It is having someone who comes back after 20 years and still calls you dad. Richard looked at Emily. I lost 20 years with you. Emily smiled through her tears. Then don't waste the next 20. Richard hugged his daughter, and for the first time in his life, the billionaire didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a father.